The Vietnam War stands as one of the most painful and divisive conflicts in American history. It was not a short war, nor was it a simple one. It unfolded over decades, crossed multiple political eras, and involved forces far beyond the jungles of Southeast Asia. More than any previous conflict, Vietnam exposed the limits of military power when strategy, politics, and public trust collapse. Vietnam and colonial rule. For much of modern history, Vietnam existed under foreign domination rather than self-rule. In the latter half of the 19th century, France consolidated control over Vietnam along with neighboring Laos and Cambodia, forming a colonial territory known as French Indochina. This arrangement was created to serve European economic and strategic interests, not the needs or aspirations of the local population. French administrators held nearly all political authority, while traditional Vietnamese governance structures were systematically weakened or dismantled. Under colonial rule, Vietnam's economy was reshaped to benefit the empire. Land was reorganized for plantations, taxes were imposed heavily on rural populations, and Vietnamese labor was exploited to extract raw materials and generate revenue for France. Education and political participation were tightly controlled, ensuring that power remained firmly in colonial hands. While French officials promoted the idea of modernization, most Vietnamese experienced colonialism as repression rather than progress. Resistance to French rule emerged almost immediately. Nationalist groups, religious movements, and local uprisings appeared across the country, driven by anger over land seizures, forced labor, and political exclusion. However, these movements were often divided by ideology, geography, and limited resources. French military power allowed colonial authorities to suppress rebellions quickly and decisively, reinforcing the image of permanent control. Despite this appearance of stability, French rule depended entirely on force. It lacked genuine legitimacy among the population. Once external pressures weakened France's ability to maintain military dominance, the colonial system began to fracture. The foundations of French Indochina were fragile, and when they finally cracked, they collapsed with remarkable speed. World War II and Vietnamese nationalism. The colonial order in Vietnam began to collapse during the Second World War. In 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany, leaving its overseas possessions vulnerable and largely undefended. Sensing opportunity, Japan moved into Indochina, occupying the region while allowing French colonial officials to remain in place as administrators. Real power, however, rested firmly with the Japanese military. For many Vietnamese, this change in rulers brought little relief. Japanese occupation quickly proved as harsh and exploitative as European colonialism. The war years were marked by extreme hardship. Japanese policies of forced labor, resource extraction, and food requisitioning led to widespread famine, particularly in northern Vietnam, where millions suffered and died. Repression intensified, and daily survival became uncertain for much of the population. These conditions radicalized Vietnamese society and accelerated the growth of nationalist sentiment across the country. Amid this chaos, organized resistance expanded rapidly. The most effective of these movements was led by Ho Chi Minh, a seasoned revolutionary who blended the demand for Vietnamese independence with socialist and anti-imperialist ideology. His organization, the Viet Minh, positioned itself as both a nationalist force and a defender of ordinary people. By fighting Japanese forces and distributing aid where possible, the Viet Minh earned broad popular support, especially in rural areas. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Vietnamese nationalists seized the moment. Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnam's independence, believing the colonial era had finally ended. That hope was short-lived. Determined to restore its empire, France soon returned to Indochina, setting the stage for another prolonged and bloody conflict. The Cold War comes to Vietnam. The war between France and Vietnamese revolutionaries dragged on for nearly a decade, draining French resources and public support. In 1954, the conflict ended in a decisive defeat for France, forcing it to withdraw from Indochina entirely. At an international conference held in Geneva, Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The communist government in the north and the Western-aligned administration in the south were meant to reunify through nationwide elections. Those elections, however, were never held, turning a temporary division into a lasting political fracture. Vietnam's internal struggle now became part of a much larger global conflict. In the context of the Cold War, the United States no longer viewed communism as a local or nationalist movement, but as an extension of Soviet and Chinese influence. American policymakers believed that if Vietnam fell under communist control, neighboring countries would soon follow, triggering a chain reaction across Southeast Asia. This fear, often referred to as the domino theory, heavily shaped U.S. decision-making. South Vietnam quickly emerged as a weak link in this strategy. Its leadership lacked legitimacy, its institutions were riddled with corruption, and its survival depended almost entirely on foreign aid. Many ordinary citizens felt little loyalty to the Southern government. Despite these flaws, South Vietnam became a test of American resolve. Preserving it was seen not just as a regional concern, but as a measure of U.S. credibility in the global struggle against communism. America's path to intervention. Initially, the United States sought to avoid direct military involvement in Vietnam. Instead, it provided military advisors, equipment, and financial assistance to support the South Vietnamese government in its struggle against the Communist North. American presidents of the 1950s and early 1960s exercised caution, wary of repeating France's mistakes and concerned about overcommitting the United States to a distant conflict. Washington hoped that advisory support and training might stabilize South Vietnam without putting American lives directly at risk. This restraint began to erode in the mid-1960s. Tensions escalated following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, during which reports suggested that North Vietnamese forces had attacked U.S. naval vessels operating in international waters. Whether these attacks were real or exaggerated, they provided the political pretext for a dramatic shift in U.S. policy. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. This marked the point at which the United States moved from indirect support to direct intervention. By early 1965, American combat troops began landing in Vietnam, initially in limited numbers, but with the clear expectation that escalation would follow. U.S. planners entered the war confident that advanced technology, superior training, and overwhelming firepower would secure a swift victory. Helicopters, artillery, and sophisticated logistics were expected to dominate a conventional battlefield. Yet Vietnam presented a very different reality. The conflict was unconventional, the enemy elusive, and the environment itself hostile. The United States had entered a war it did not fully understand, one that would test its military, political, and social limits in ways no previous engagement had. The nature of the enemy. American forces in Vietnam faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. In the South, the Viet Cong operated as a hidden insurgent network, deeply embedded among civilians. They moved fluidly through villages, rice paddies, and forests, often indistinguishable from ordinary farmers. This made it extremely difficult for U.S. troops to identify combatants and limited the effectiveness of conventional tactics. Any attack risked harming civilians and driving more support to the insurgents. In the North Vietnamese army presented a more organized opponent. Well-trained and disciplined, the NVA received weapons, ammunition, and logistical support from the Soviet Union and China. They were capable of both conventional and guerrilla operations, adjusting tactics based on circumstances. Despite US technological superiority, the NVA relied on patience and endurance, knowing direct battles were often disadvantageous. Withdrawal and collapse. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had become deeply unpopular at home. Years of heavy casualties, televised combat, and widespread revelations of government deception had eroded public support. Facing mounting opposition from both citizens and Congress, the United States began the process of withdrawing its combat forces. In 1973, after extensive negotiations in Paris, American troops officially left Vietnam, marking the end of direct US military involvement. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. The fall of the city marked the definitive end of the Vietnam War. For the United States, it was a humbling conclusion to a conflict that had begun with high hopes and technological superiority, but ended with a retreat under political, military, and social pressure. The war left deep scars on Vietnam, the United States, and the world, shaping foreign policy and public consciousness for decades to come. The legacy of Vietnam. The Vietnam War left a profound and lasting impact on the United States and the world, reshaping American foreign policy, military strategy, and public trust. It revealed the limits of military power when applied without a clear understanding of political, cultural, and social realities. Superior technology, firepower, and resources proved insufficient in the face of an adaptable enemy deeply connected to the local population. The war demonstrated that military strength alone cannot secure victory if it is not paired with legitimacy, strategy, and political purpose. Today, Vietnam remains a cautionary tale and a lesson for leaders, soldiers, and citizens alike. It underscores the importance of strategy, legitimacy, and the recognition that ultimate victory requires more than military might. It demands alignment with political realities, local populations, and global perceptions. The echoes of Vietnam continue to influence military thinking, diplomacy, and public discourse both around the world. Use strategies designed to exploit American weaknesses. Ambushes, booby traps, tunnels, and hit-and-run attacks replaced conventional battles. Psychological tactics, including propaganda, aimed to weaken morale among US troops and their allies. Front lines were fluid and often invisible. This approach frustrated American commanders. Technology and firepower offered little advantage when the enemy could disappear and strike unpredictably. The shifting battlefield tested US confidence and endurance, showing that victory would require more than conventional military strength alone. US military strategy. US military leadership in Vietnam relied heavily on a strategy of attrition, believing that the war could be won by inflicting more casualties on the enemy than they could replace. This approach focused on large-scale bombing campaigns, search and destroy missions, and constant pressure on suspected Viet Cong and North Vietnamese positions. Progress was measured primarily through body counts and the destruction of enemy infrastructure rather than political or social gains. While these tactics demonstrated tactical successes, they largely ignored the political and cultural realities of Vietnam. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were willing to endure staggering losses to achieve their goals, and the destruction of villages, farmland, and civilian infrastructure often strengthened local support for the insurgency. Every bombed village or civilian casualty created more recruits for the enemy, undermining the very objectives the US sought to achieve. American commanders frequently reported progress and optimism to policymakers in Washington, but the reality on the ground was far more complex. US forces could control territory temporarily, yet guerrilla fighters melted away into forests, tunnels, and villages, only to return when conditions were favorable. The lack of clear front lines, coupled with the enemy's resilience and adaptability, meant that victories were often temporary and Pyrrhic. Ultimately, the attrition strategy failed to account for the most critical aspect of the conflict, the political and social dimension. Military might alone could not win hearts and minds, and the US approach gradually eroded both domestic support and the morale of troops deployed to a war where success was measured in numbers rather than meaningful outcomes. The Tet Offensive. In early 1968, the illusion of American progress in Vietnam was shattered by the Tet Offensive, a massive, coordinated series of attacks by communist forces across South Vietnam. Tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers struck more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations, including the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. The offensive coincided with the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, or Tet, a holiday traditionally observed as a ceasefire period, which added a profound psychological impact. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the attackers. US and South Vietnamese forces inflicted devastating casualties on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops, eliminating key units and blunting the momentum of the assault. Yet, despite these tactical successes, the psychological and political effects were profound. The widespread attacks demonstrated that the enemy remained capable, organized, and unbowed, contradicting US claims that victory was near. The offensive shocked the American public. For years, official statements and media reports had suggested that the United States was steadily gaining the upper hand. Tet exposed the stark reality. The war was far from won. Graphic images of urban combat, street fighting, and civilian casualties broadcast on television eroded public confidence and deepened skepticism about government claims. Tet marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, not because it succeeded militarily, but because it shifted perceptions. It revealed the resilience of the communist forces, the fragility of American assumptions, and the growing divide between reality on the ground and the optimistic narratives presented to the public. From this point forward, the war would be defined as much by politics and public opinion as by battlefield victories.